Я люблю Украину, что я тут родился.
И вы хотите жить в Украине всегда?
Да.
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 Чому?
Бо тут гарно. Тут гарно.
Тут гарно.
We will start this panel. The video that was going on up there was put together. The young woman with the two children there at the end is an intern for the foundation who a couple of months ago, wanted to go to Ukraine, and both her parents and her professors supported her going, and so she went with Oksana. Oksana was there for a month, and she was there for a couple of weeks, and she took some videos, and that is one of them. And she's going to be putting out a series, and the first one was quite something, and this is very good. Okay, this panel, tracking, combating disinformation and propaganda. One of our Friends of Ukraine network members who could not be here because he's traveling for the very reason of Ukraine, General Philip Breedlove, has made the point over and over. In fighting wars, the approach is DIME. D for diplomacy, I for information and disinformation, M for military, and E for economics. We're here, Putin is using all facets of his war making, and we're here to talk on this panel about the information disinformation campaign that he's got going. John Herbst made a comment about his enjoyment, did he say, was following Russian media. I'm not sure about that, but that is all disinformation. Our panelists, Don is he's the director of the Russia and Europe, it needs to be changed to Ukraine and Europe, office at the U.S. Institute for Peace. The rest of Don's resume has a lot of stuff in it, but when I'm around him and he's telling stories, there's things he did that aren't on that resume. He's in touch with people that don't fit that resume, but he's very well connected. And one of the things he did do is he was with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty at the time they were adjusting from the end of the Cold War, modernizing and getting ready for his current mission. Gordon Crovitz, Nadia and I met Gordon, I was trying to figure out how long ago. We were a lot younger.
Yes.
It was before the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. It was back when it may have been in the millennium of Christianity. It may have been at the time of the Holodomor, or trying to get the famine commission started. But he was with the Wall Street Journal, and we met him, and we've been compatriots on Ukraine ever since. In the intervening years, he's had many important positions as a journalist, as an executive for the Wall Street Journal. We missed him for a number of years because he was in Hong Kong running the Far East publication of the journal. But he's a co-founder of NewsGuard, which he will tell you about, that monitors disinformation. And I think we have a great panel for this discussion. And I guess I would start by just both of your impressions. Putin is using all facets in this war. But I think it's curious to maybe just look at and then go from what started first against Ukraine: propaganda and disinformation, or tanks and war? Gordon, I'll call on you first.
Great. Bob, thank you very much. Nadia, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So I actually have a very precise answer to your question. So one of the things that NewsGuard does is, as you mentioned, Bob, is we track false narratives and other disinformation from hostile powers in order to help protect democracies from misinformation and disinformation. And we work with some other companies, including Microsoft, which has quite advanced technological abilities in order to identify provenance of false narratives. Where do they begin? How did they start? And after the war began militarily in February, we were in the process of tracking false narratives. By the way, we're up to 126 significant false narratives as of this morning. One of them you're probably familiar with, I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with, is the false claim that the US maintains bioweapons labs in Ukraine. That was very popular in Russian domestic media and foreign media after the invasion militarily. But actually, that false narrative was what we call prepositioned disinformation. So we and Microsoft were able to determine that the provenance of that claim in anticipation of the military invasion was actually in November, months before the military invasion in February, where a quite well-known American based in Moscow posted on YouTube, owned by Google, a video falsely claiming that the US maintained bioweapons labs. Nobody paid it much attention. It seemed an esoteric claim at the time. Didn't even get much traffic. But as soon as the military invasion began in February, all of a sudden the Russian propaganda machine reported, as is well known, the US operates bioweapons labs in Ukraine, citing this prepositioned disinformation from November on YouTube. So to your question, Bob, of did the tanks come first or did the disinformation come first? As is often the case with Russia, the disinformation came first. People who followed Ukraine, of course, are familiar with Russian disinformation for years and years. But for this particular operation by the Russians, the disinformation did come first.
Don?
Don't you hate when one of your panelists slightly reconfigures your question?
It's fine with me.
So I will slightly, excuse my voice, have laryngitis. I would say they came at the same time. If you understand that disinformation is part of the arsenal of Russian weapons to exert malign influence abroad. So there's disinformation, military bribery, religion, arms sales. Do you hear me okay, Nadia? Excuse me. And so the Russians consider disinformation just one facet of warfare, as General Breedlove said. So I would make the distinction between kinetic and non-kinetic levers to advance Russian interests. So in 2014, they worked together. A lot of fools in Washington believed the Russian narrative, and they tried it again, as you said, Gordon, this year. And I think less successfully. And I think the reasons why it's been less successful are worth talking about. And also the changes between 2014 and now are worth talking about. Not that we have time today necessarily. In particular, the fact that Ukraine has very skillfully used narrative information operations for its benefit. And that never happened before. The US even has done it sometimes relatively skillfully, and the Kremlin has not. And the Kremlin has been pretty successful in using information operations to control its population, although we see fraying at the seams. However, the Kremlin info war ran into reality in Bucha and other places. So this for me is very interesting because I'm an adjunct of Hopkins, which is not on my bio. And there's a generation of grad students who write about narratives and information operations, both in a vacuum, without reference to Russian foreign policy, but also without reference to the changes, the role of the environment, why it sometimes does not work. And if you look at it that way, I think they both sort of came hand in glove in 2014 and now, but the way it has operated has been markedly different and provides lessons, which frankly, the Ukrainians have been very skillful at learning and applying.
I think it's an excellent
I'll have
point.
some more tea, Gordon. So while you're
You have some more tea, and I'm going to expand on what you said. I think one of the underappreciated accomplishments of the Putin government was so skillfully to weaponize the open internet in the West. And that particularly happened before February, exactly as you say. It's not well understood, but for years and years and years, the single most popular source of news on YouTube has been RT, Russia Today. That's true in the US, the UK, Germany, other parts of Europe. And it's not that Google set out to amplify Russian disinformation. And it's not that Americans and Brits and Germans want to consume Russian disinformation. News consumers have no idea what RT stands for. It sounds like the AP or BBC or CBC or who knows what, NBC. The Russians were extremely skillful. They invested an enormous amount of money in RT as a social media outlet. They targeted Google and YouTube. There's a wonderful video still available on YouTube of RT celebrating becoming the first news channel on YouTube to get 1 billion views. It later got 10 billion. But on that show celebrating 1 billion views on RT, a senior Google executive appeared praising RT as being authentic and not propaganda. So I think one of the unasked and as of yet unanswered questions is, how did it come to be that our digital platforms enabled Russian disinformation? We spent most of today talking about what further military help the West, the US in particular, can give. That's a worthy topic. I think when it comes to disinformation, we're actually in a worse position, which is it's not a question of how much can we arm Ukraine. It's a question of when are we going to stop arming Russia? The amount of disinformation from Russia, even though it's much less effective than it was in 2014, is still extraordinary. NewsGuard, we actually put out a report just this morning indicating that TikTok has now had 1 billion views. 1 billion views. That's one for every 7th person alive in the world, that glorify the Wagner Group and its behavior in Ukraine. Many of those 1 billion views are views some of you may have seen of a sledgehammer killing a soldier who had fought for Ukraine. TikTok, of course, is owned by the Chinese government, but TikTok is far from alone. I've mentioned YouTube as a unintended ally of Russia. But I think we can talk about this a bit more, but I think we have so much more work to do to understand information warfare than we do military warfare. Military warfare, the West and the US are pretty good and experienced. I think when it comes to disinformation, the Russians are quite far ahead of us.
If I could ask you, Gordon raised a very interesting point about what's different from 2014. And then you had Twitter, verbal, 140 characters, was it? Conveying often ridiculous messages, which some people believed, others didn't. But now the platforms have indeed widened. And TikTok, you see film clips on, especially sites, pro-Ukrainian sites that have been very effective in combating the Russian information line. You see Ukrainian jets bombing the heck out of, I didn't say hell, heck out of Russian positions. You see the butchery, you see all that in a way you couldn't do in 2014. And this broadening of the platforms, I think, has helped, not always, but largely helped Ukraine. The second point I would make is that the open source information process is much more developed. And I don't know how many people here read the ISW war summary every evening with the cool maps, and you see where the Russians are advancing. That is a very, very effective way, I think, to undermine the Russian narrative, because you see they're not winning. You see there are partisan activities near Kherson. You see this stuff, and I think it's been sort of an unintended way that the old style narrative information warfare has been undermined a little bit. And again, the Ukrainians have been excellent at doing it.
I do need to insert. Don has mentioned that map that's done out daily. It is done by a former intern of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. No, Boris.
Yeah. So every evening they send it out. You get a summary. It's for the layman. It's like reading The Economist with a map. And you see what's going on. There are pictures sometimes. And that is a broader way of putting information out there to counter the Russian narrative. And I think you can't measure it, but I think it's been very, very effective. If I can make one more point here, which is that in 2014, forgive me, Bob and Nadia, no one really knew what Ukraine was in Washington. And so unfortunately, you inject a Russian silly narrative into a think tank land policy community, which doesn't know the nuances as well. And so, excuse me, you've got a country divided by language, or a country divided by religion, or this or that. And that's, in many cases, in almost all cases, simply not true. But even if those of you who went to graduate school here, Russian history is dominated by this sort of imperial point of view. And it's simply not true or exaggerated, but that's what's in people's minds, whether you're in INR or at a think tank or whatever. And once that's in there, it's very hard to refute. And so you still see journalists all the time talking about the country divided by, you fill in the language. That's simply not true. But I always laugh that Ukrainian ambassadors here often start any discussion of policy with Kievan Rus 1,000 years ago and how this happened and this happened. But the Russians have weaponized history as well. And you have to say that because a lot of people still don't believe it.
And we can also analyze what the Russian narratives are and the emphasis, and even now, even with what you say and the better understanding of the situation based on our data, a third of the false narrative, the most popular false narratives the Russians are promoting are false narratives about Ukraine, the nature of Ukraine, Nazi Ukraine, part of Russia, Ukraine. The other 2/3 are more tactical, but it still remains part of the Russian disinformation effort, and they target people who are not as knowledgeable, people in the West who are not as knowledgeable, and while they're clearly less effective than they were before, I would still say it's the best investment that they've made.
Yeah. And it's also susceptible to external events. For example, the Kremlin talking about nuclear war was big in September, then it fell off. Then they started to attack NATO, then they start to attack something else, often in response to diplomatic or other events or facts on the ground. And it's not very credible when you change the narrative right 3 times in 1 week, but it is credible to some people, which is, as you said.
Well, accepting that it's not as effective in relation to Ukraine as it was in 2014, it's still out there and influencing people. What is it that we can do to counteract it more effectively?
I think we're all familiar with the broader problem of how difficult it's become to tell generally trustworthy news from generally untrustworthy news. This is not unique to Russia, Ukraine. This is common in healthcare topics, a lot of misinformation about vaccines. I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about measles and vaccines for little kids, where if you're a parent now and you do a search, is it dangerous to immunize my kids against measles and rubella? Half the search results you'll see will be based on bad science. And that has helped lead to a resurgence in measles, even in the US and parts of Europe. So the analogy that I give, and some people in this room may remember this, before the internet, you might go to a newsstand and say, I'd like a copy of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I don't want National Enquirer. On the internet, everything looks like the Philadelphia Inquirer, and a lot of it is National Enquirer. And it's in the nature of how we get our news. Unfortunately, now people get their news on Facebook or on TikTok or Instagram, maybe through search. And every source looks kind of like another source. And the Russians figured this out. Russia Today started as a cable TV channel called Russia Today. When they invested in social media, they said, let's call it RT instead. Maybe people won't know the R stands for Russia. And let's invest in neat videos about gerbils chasing cats and car crashes and natural disasters. And let's get people to follow this thing called RT on YouTube. And then we'll occasionally insert some pro-Putin video. But really, it's a sleeper site for our efforts if we ever need it, like with the invasion of Ukraine. So I think one of the lessons is that we need much greater information going to news consumers about the nature of the sources that they're encountering on these platforms. People should know when they see something on YouTube from RT, it ought to come with a giant starburst that says, this is Russian propaganda. Some of you may be old enough or learned it enough to have read in graduate school Soviet Life magazine or Izvestia or Pravda in the Soviet era. In 1937, Congress passed a law called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, mostly these days invoked having to do with lobbying, but the original purpose was to protect news consumers in the US from Nazi and then Soviet propaganda. That law says that if you are distributing news, whether it's a magazine or a newspaper or digital content, if you're distributing news paid for by a hostile foreign country, a category into which Russia, I think, fits, under that law, you're obliged to disclose to readers that you've had to register at the Department of Justice because you're distributing foreign propaganda. You may have noticed when you are on the internet, you're not getting starburst disclosures saying this news story is from a source of Russian or Chinese or Iranian disinformation. The digital platforms have ignored FARA, and administrations from both parties have essentially let FARA into abeyance when it comes to the original purpose of the law. So interestingly, this is not a case where we need a new law. This is a case where the law that we have should be enforced. And under the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, whether the Attorney General was Bill Barr or Merrick Garland, there's been a reluctance to enforce FARA for whatever reasons. I think that would actually make a tremendous difference. At NewsGuard, we have disclosure for anybody who's using our service. It immediately tells you the nature of the source, but YouTube is not obliged to make those disclosures. TikTok is not obliged. Facebook is not obliged. Twitter is not obliged. And they feel very little accountability. And as a result, they've become unintentionally the useful idiots of Russian propaganda. So to me, the answer to your question, Bob, is we have to do a lot more to empower citizens in the West to know much more about the nature of sources, particularly in this case, Russian disinformation.
Nadia, do you have a question?
I have a question and a comment. Gordon, it's interesting you mentioned FARA because 2014, we did just a very cursory research on firms that were registered as lobbyists for Russia. One of the most intriguing ones was the firm that Frank Luntz was a part of. Their whole firm is about choosing the right words, right? They're the one that gave us death tax instead of the estate tax, right? To make it more palatable, or climate change instead of global warming. So the level of sophistication that the Russians are using really surprised me. Now to a question, is there any way to do regarding propaganda and disinformation sort of virtually like the Institute for the Study of War? I've looked at your report, you know, where you said, but is there a way to put it in more user-friendly, or, you know, for the millennials, right, who want to see videos and things like that? Is there any way to, or are you pursuing the idea of that?
Well, I don't want to do a commercial for NewsGuard, but since you asked, there are companies like Microsoft and more responsible digital platforms that do provide information about the nature of sources to their users and work with us to help give news consumers some idea of whether they're looking at a reliable source or an unreliable source. And I think probably this experience with Russian disinformation will accelerate that, but there's an awful lot of work to be done, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent by hostile foreign governments on their disinformation efforts, and you can't blame them. The digital platforms are open platforms. They've not exercised accountability in so many areas, not just foreign disinformation. And, I think that situation has to change.
The Russians become very clever in the last few years in responding and adjusting to our initial concern and response. It's much, when you have what appears to be a standard news story and the Russians bury something extremist in the final 10% of it, it's very hard to then ban the whole thing, because the Russians cleverly, and more than in the past, have adjusted the content to do that. And there's a lot of Americans are reluctant to clamp down on the media. And that, I think, happens a lot. Number two is that in communist times, you have useful idiots. There are people who accept the Russian position. And you and I have talked about some of those people. And they may not even be conscious of it, but it's given a platform. You know more than I do on this, for that point of view, because it's from a respectable think tank or a respectable scholar, and it's just not true, or the Russians may bankroll part of a study or whatever, and that goes on a lot. It's very hard to unpeel all that and respond in a policy relevant way. I'm a little bit skeptical, Gordon, of this kind of refuting with facts bad stories, because it's almost impossible to do it. But again, if I could praise the Ukrainians, their response since February 24th, I think, has been very impressive, because they have created their own narrative of courageous freedom fighters defending against the barbaric Russian invader, which in fact I believe, but it's been the Ukrainians have created their own narrative, which frankly has won Europe and much of the world to its cause. And you don't see much about how many people the Ukrainians have lost, or even the bad behavior of some Ukrainian troops. And that has been, I think, very effective. And I can't think of many examples, Gordon, like that, where there's an alternative narrative that sort of pushes out the Russian one. And it's not that kind of tit for tat factual refutation.
So two things. I think you're right that Ukraine has done an excellent job, as you say, of crowding out Russian disinformation. The Taiwanese have done an excellent job of crowding out mainland Chinese disinformation using some of the same techniques. We're supposed to disagree on something, so let me disagree on one thing, which is I don't think it's that hard actually to empower news consumers with the information they need to discount anything published by a Russian disinformation source. So our analysts have identified just over 300 sources of Russian disinformation. So it's obviously many more than just RT and Sputnik and a few more, but 300 is not a million. And they have names like Veterans Today, Russophile. They have names that make it look like anything but Russian disinformation. But if you have analysts who understand what's going on, you can identify and figure out who actually owns it and operates it. And having identified these 300 sources, if all of those sources, whenever anything published by them, came with a disclosure, we're not in favor of censoring anybody, by the way, either. Let Putin be on YouTube and TikTok, but let it come with a giant disclosure so that people know who's feeding them the news. If every one of those 300 and some sources of Russian disinformation came with a warning, that would significantly decrease people's belief in and likelihood to share disinformation from Russia. And even though that it's much less successful than it was, it's ridiculous that it's successful at all. It's really not that hard to empower news consumers with information. We just haven't done it.
Oh, we have a question over here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Chris Simon with I'm just wondering, you alluded to it a little bit in your earlier comments. There's certain well-established people within the U.S. foreign policy community, like Katrina Vanden Heuvel, John J. Mearsheimer, who really have a real anti-Ukrainian slant to their arguments, to the point where they say that Ukraine is not within the national interest of the United States, but they don't really back it up with any reason why. And they really seem to go out of their way to sort of discredit the idea that the United States is supporting Ukraine in any way, even as far as to take the Russian sort of narrative. Is there an explanation for that beyond, I guess, the useful media argument, or because well, I want to name names. Dimitri Signs has also been kind of known to be anti-Ukrainian. Is there more to that, or is it just what you sort of said, that they're established, they've been widely denied by Russians in the past?
I couldn't hear without the microphone for the whole question.
Did you hear?
Oh, yeah, I heard. I think I'll give my answer, and maybe in answering, you'll perceive the question. My concern is within the democratic argument within Western countries, we can have an open debate about this and that, and academics can say what they want to say, and even the nation can publish what the nation wants to publish, so long as people have some background on the nature of the source, they can incorporate that into their thinking. And the immediate issue that we have is that the Russians are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on disinformation, targeting virtually every country you can think of, not just the US, but every European country and countries outside of Europe as well. And doing it without really any roadblocks other than how much they're willing to spend. So to me, that's the bigger question. There are always going to be disagreements within our countries. I think that's perfectly normal and good. What I think is problematic is a failure of disclosure when it comes to foreign disinformation, of which there's more now than there's ever been, because of the nature of how we get our information and the fact that the Silicon Valley platforms refuse aggressively to take responsibility for what appears on their platforms.
If I could add to that and sort of criticize journalism in this cathedral of journalism, I get calls every day beyond at 2 o'clock on this place, Al Jazeera, VOA, and you give your 20 seconds, which is all you're allowed to answer. And then when it's in print, you'll see that the journalist will, in the need to show balance, will then reproduce a Russian argument to show balance. And this is very true of Ukraine. It's divided by language. And a country divided by language. Well, that's just a Russian propaganda line. But journalists don't have the time. They have editorial deadlines. I understand that, to fill it out. And this is really, really a difficult problem, because a lot of life can't be expressed in 20-second sound bites. The other thing you're seeing in the past 6 months is that people are watching what difference in Russian behavior does their losses in the war have. Is it more or less aggressive? And in Latin America and in Africa, the Russian narratives have changed to stress the colonial, anti-Western traditional attitudes that many of those societies have. And that explains partly the reason why the global South, as I say, has not gone along with us or the Europeans in the UN voting, because the Russians play this story in a way that is to their advantage. The NATO expansion argument is, you hear all the time, and one can argue whether that is a threatening thing to Russia or not. And I was in the government at the time, and no one really thought about it one way or the other. But the NATO expansion being a threat to the Kremlin is something that's always cited with very little supporting evidence. It's just, well, it must be a threat. And that's always used in these debates in the media about what's going on and how to interpret Russian behavior. If I could slightly change the subject on Russia, which no one wants to talk about here, but for good reason. But one of the new dimensions of information warfare inside Russia is the growth of so-called mill bloggers, which are critics of the Kremlin who use social media to attack Ukraine often, but also to attack Russia's government and its policies in the Ministry of Defense. And that's completely new in a way that we've seen the trouble in China in the last few days, in a way that I think nobody really expected to see inside Russia. The problem is a lot of those bloggers are even more whacked out patriotic extremists than Putin. But you do see this tension now where a lot of them criticize how the war is being conducted. How do you mean we're losing? They don't say it's Putin's fault, but they say it's the general staff's fault. And that's completely new. And there's another dimension of political warfare, information warfare, that really is so new, people really haven't even written about it much, but it's every day. It's there. There's something called Telegram channels, which are social media channels originated by a Russian team. And they're better than reading RT or Sputnik, finding out what's going on. So people now focus on that.
Oh, we have a question. Another intern.
Hello, thank you. My name is Angela Howard. I'm a current member of the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War and volunteering today as AV for the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. I thought your discussion of mill bloggers was particularly interesting. It's a very fascinating area, but I wanted to return to your discussion on source validation, fact-checking. And I think a major issue is how we can convince people to trust the fact-checking, because the Russian narrative, especially when you mention the Foreign Agents Act, has been any kind of crackdown supports their use and violation of it. And it's obviously very different in the United States than the Russian implementation. But how can you prevent them from capitalizing on that narrative?
Yeah. So I think you may all be aware of the irony that the Russians copied elements of our Foreign Agent Registration Act, declared some of the the U.S. government agencies as foreign agents, which I suppose they are, and fined them, including, I think, Voice of America. So the irony being that they're enforcing a law that we passed originally for the Nazis, then the Soviets, in their own way. So I would like to win the battle of informing citizens in the West first, before we take on the much more difficult challenge of helping Russians understand better the way the world works. They've had a generation now of challenges in understanding how the world works. Similar situation in China, where it's 2 generations, maybe 3. So I think the more urgent problem really is there's a reason the Russians are spending hundreds of millions of dollars seeking to influence opinion in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. And we need to do more to make that investment less valuable for them.
Hi, Alex Merle. I won't explain what I do, but I work a lot with Ukraine, including the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. Some of it's on disinformation, but I just wanted to jump in on that point. I think the fundamental problem is actually here in being able to distinguish what Russia is and isn't. We continue, although less so than since February 24th, to pretend that Russia's inside our system. We didn't pretend the Soviet Union was. We understood they were external and an adversary to be beaten. That was it. So it didn't matter what they were saying. Some of it might have been true, not true. We paid it no mind. And we just assumed that they were external and to be beaten. And we've pretended since the collapse of the Soviet Union, partially as a result of our own foolishness, end of history and all of that, that they were in the fold, which they never were. So I think that the simple change that we have to make is just assume that they're external and to be beaten, and then that's it. The rest becomes very easy. And you stop accepting RT as someone that you would put on your television shows. It's just done all of it until they have a fundamental shift in their internal systems and structures, which might take a while. But
well, it's certainly unimaginable in the pre-Internet era to imagine Soviet life being the best-selling magazine at a newsstand in the US. And yet RT is the most popular source of news on YouTube. So you're absolutely right. It's an enormous shift meant for many reasons.
We are not only toward the end of our panel, but we're at the end of the day. But before, Nadia, before, you know, when you're talking about all this, it does remind me of one thing. Back in the days of the Soviet Union, we had broadcasts, trying to broadcast Radio Free Europe and so forth. First trip to Ukraine, we were driving out across Western Ukraine, and we came over a hill. It's hard to describe it. It used to be something like out at Annapolis near the Naval Academy. At night, there were just towers and towers that could reach every one of our ships and submarines around the world. I mean, at night, these lights were everywhere because there were so many towers. When we came over that hill, it made what we saw in Annapolis look like an old television aerial. It was just massive, massive. And I said, what is that? A jamming station. The Soviet Union didn't want anything from the outside to cross the quote unquote Iron Curtain. Times have really changed. Times have very much changed, and Nadia wants to say something.
Well, first to thank Don and Gordon for joining us. And I know we have people that are watching virtually and that we will then be posting each of our panels. This has been, I think, an extremely important discussion, we know, and perhaps we can do it again where it's strictly on this one topic and give more time for questions. So again, thank you so much for really covering a very important topic.
Gordon came down from New York and goes back.
Yes,
Just for
made
this
special
panel.
effort. Yes, thank you, Gordon. Closing remarks. It's been quite the day, and I think at the beginning I said this should be this cannot be just a conference where we're talking, but this is a call to action in so many ways. One, for the immediacy of trying to help the people of Ukraine survive the winter, and we did a little bit of calling to action, but also the importance of medium and long-term assistance in these very important spheres well, we had national security and the economic discussion, and certainly nothing less important than with disinformation and propaganda discussion. So thank you very much.